Hi, it's Dr. Winbush with Sankofa Healing Arts and Functional Medicine, and I'm continuing to go through and answer some of the questions that I'd been getting from those previous video posts. So in this video, I'm going to answer how can we start to know or get some insights into what's going on with our adrenal response and our adrenal health. I'm going to also touch on briefly trauma and nervous system dysregulation and how that impacts the adrenal response. And then I'm going to answer a question that was posed about the impacts of chronic steroids on our adrenal response. So I'm going to try to keep this short. We'll see how I do. So the first is, how do we know what's going on with our adrenals? And many of the signs and symptoms that there may be some adrenal or that there may be some impairment in the stress response can overlap with other health conditions. And so it's really helpful to look for patterns. Patterns are the idea that you're noticing something happening as it relates to your energy or some other symptom at a similar time every day or most days. And it's also helpful to know what the pattern of cortisol response should be, or dare I say, a normal cortisol response. And in this instance, I think normal is an okay word to use. And so in general, we should start to see our cortisol levels, they're elevating overnight, and it's in the early morning hours, the elevation in cortisol, which eventually reaches its peak or close to its peak, that gives us this sense of like, oh, it's time to get up. And generally our cortisol levels should peak about a half hour after we wake up, and then they stay fairly high during the first part of the day and then gradually start to decrease into the evening. And cortisol is actually a mirror of melatonin, which is the opposite, that melatonin levels generally are low during the day and then should start to rise in the early evening, preparing us to go to sleep and to help us stay asleep. And then those melatonin levels fall overnight. So they actually are this mirror of one another. So things that, based on what we just talked about what that cortisol curve looks like, at least physiologically, what might map onto that in terms of things that would characterize a balanced stress response, things you might see: awakening in the morning, feeling rested, an adequate feeling of energy to get through your day most of the time, with a gradual decline in energy as you're heading into the evening, the ability to wind down and fall asleep relatively easily, and an appetite that's moderate and not really characterized by a lot of cravings. So again, many of us may fall short of that mark, and it may not just be cortisol, but those are some things that would characterize generally a balanced stress response. So in contrast, some signs and symptoms of imbalanced stress response could include difficulty waking up, feeling like you're just dragging in the morning, difficulty falling asleep, especially feeling tired but wired and just not able to wind down, sharp drops in energy that happen suddenly at certain points of the day or following eating, low exercise tolerance and just a difficulty recovering from moderate exercise, marked food and sugar cravings, decreased stress handling that might be characterized by increased irritability, feeling easily overwhelmed, an enhanced startle response, and in extreme forms, feelings of severe exhaustion and fatigue, and actually becoming more susceptible to illness and developing chemical sensitivities. So it's easy to see that there's many points of overlap between some of those things that I just discussed and other diagnoses and conditions, and that's because all of these systems are interconnected. That's just true. For instance, having kind of brittle or imbalanced blood sugars that may trigger fatigue after eating because of the impacts of cortisol, right? Cortisol actually leads to more glucose being circulated in the blood, which then itself can lead to more insulin. And if that's happening all the time, you can become resistant to insulin, and you can also have sharp falls in the blood sugar. And again, not trying to get into the weeds there, but all of these things are interconnected. So a history of trauma, unprocessed trauma, chronic anxiety, all of those things can be an activation, a chronic activation of the stress response. So a lot of the things that we talked about in terms of symptoms that can characterize that may go along with that. If someone's been on chronic steroid medications, when you're on chronic steroids, that's actually going to suppress your body's own manufacture of cortisol, right? So it's going to stop doing it because it says, oh, there's plenty of steroids around. They don't need me to do this. And that's why when it's time to stop that medication, that will gradually be tapered down to give the body a chance to kind of wake up that production again. And certainly, I mean, I've seen this clinically, it's not always an immediate or seamless process, and it can take some time to get back that flexibility and that responding. And obviously it's going to be individual depending on what else is going on in that person's life in terms of physical health, in terms of emotional health, in terms of other sources of stressors, in terms of how readily they're able to kind of get back to what was their previous baseline of functioning. So that's a lot. Hopefully that made sense. It's possible. What I want to leave you with is that it really is possible to gain some significant insights about what might be happening with your body's ability to respond to chronic stressors and the adrenal stress response through tracking patterns, through self-reflection, through checking in with other people that we're in community with. And it is also possible to do some assessment of hormone levels like cortisol, which can be helpful for some people depending on how they best receive support and what their goals are. It's not necessary all the time, and it's not necessarily even accessible to a lot of folks, but sometimes it can be helpful. And I'll talk about that in a future video. All right, thanks.